right, so now we're going to be looking at factoring by grouping. So when we are factoring by grouping, I have 4 terms, and I'm going to group those into 2 sets. Okay, so first thing we want to do is check for greatest common factor. After that, we are going to form our 2 groups. We're going to find our greatest common factor for the first group, and then we're going to factor out the greatest common factor for the second group. What we have left, we're going to put into 2 matching parentheses. Okay, so example 1, I'm going to set up my groups. So I'm just taking my 4 terms and creating 2 groups out of that. So my first group, right now I'm going to factor out of both of those groups. So my first group, my greatest common factor. So I have x to the third and a 2x squared. I can factor out the smallest exponent, so I can factor out an x squared out of both of those. My second factor, I've got 5x and a 10, so I can factor a 5 out of both of those. Okay, so I'm going to factor out the x squared out of the first set of parentheses. That will leave me with an x and a plus 2. Next, I'm going to factor a 5 out of the second set of parentheses. That would leave me with an x and a plus 2 again. So you can see that we have the same thing inside each of these sets of parentheses. If I have that, I know that I did it correct, and then I can set up my final factored form. Okay, so to set up my final factor form, I take the greatest common factors that are in front of my 2 parentheses, and I put them into a parenthesis together. So x squared plus 5, and then I take the 2 matching parentheses into 1. Okay, so that is my factored form. All right, example 2. Again, I'm going to set up my 2 sets of groupings. I'm going to find my greatest common factor for each of those groupings. So out of my y to the third power and 3y squared, I can factor out a y to the second power. That's my lowest exponent. Next, out of the second parenthesis, I have a 4y and a plus 12. So out of those 2, I can factor out a 4. All right, so I'm going to factor out the y squared out of the first parenthesis. That leaves me with a y and a plus 3. Then I'm going to factor a 4 out of my second parenthesis. That's going to leave me with a y and a plus 3. So again, inside of my parentheses, I have those matching. I'm going to put the greatest common factors into 1 parenthesis together. So y squared plus 4, and then my y plus 3. Okay, and it doesn't matter which order you do those in. If you did the y plus 3 as your first parenthesis and your y squared plus 4 as your second parenthesis, you're still going to get the same answer. Okay. Let's set up our groupings. Find my greatest common factors. So out of my first parenthesis, I can divide out a k to the second power. Out of my second parenthesis, I can factor out 4. So I'm going to do my k to the second, which will leave me with a k and a minus 7. So if I did this correctly, I should be left with a k minus 7 inside of this parenthesis, which I can see I will. I'm going to set up my final factored answer. Okay, set up my groupings. Find my greatest common factors. And factor those out. Okay, set up my final parentheses. Nope, that should just be it. Hold on, let me back up. Let me start over here. There we go. That looks better. Okay, so that is my final factored answer. Okay, set up my groupings. Okay, so on this one, I can factor 2 and an x squared out of the first parenthesis. My second parenthesis, I can factor out a 5. So I'm left with an x plus 3 inside. Do my second parenthesis. And I'm left with an x plus 3 again. Okay, set up my final factored form. And that is my solution. Okay, one last example. Set up my groupings. Okay, this one is a little bit different. So now I have a minus here. I'm going to change that to a plus, which means I'm going to bring the minus inside the parenthesis and it's going to become a negative. Now I'm going to find my greatest common factor. And I can factor out a negative 4. It's going to leave me with an x plus 1. And I factored out the negative 4. So that's going to leave me with an x plus 1. Okay, if I had only factored out a positive 4, it's going to leave me with a negative inside of the second parenthesis, which isn't going to match with the first parenthesis. That's why we had to factor out a negative 4. Okay, so now we're going to set up our final factored form. And x plus 1. Okay, so there is my final factored answer.